What's up, everybody? Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Glenn Davis, your host. Thanks for being with us. We get started. John chapter 7.
Here's each winding path I tread. Gives me grace for every trial. Feeds me with the living bread.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We jump into John chapter 7 today. We dropped it off at our last time together at the end of verse 24. Verse 25 kind of sets the stage of a dynamic that will play out in the rest of the life of Jesus. Chapter 6 for John, we've said this before, but chapter 6 of John is really a turning point in John's gospel. The disciples have to determine whether they're going to follow Jesus, whether they're going to go with Jesus where he should lead them. Chapter 7 is the public appearance of Jesus. Jesus' brothers tell him to go to the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a feast of celebration, where the Jews celebrated God's faithfulness to them, to their ancestors, while walking through the wilderness when they lived in tabernacles as a nomadic people. Brothers said, "Go up and show yourself." Jesus went privately. Then when he got there, he began to speak publicly in the temple. And the Jews, and we'll see this in today's reading, the Jews who are the leaders, right? John makes a distinction between the Jews and the crowd. The crowd is the ordinary folk, the folks who believe in the God of the Bible, who come to the feast, who celebrate, who are interested in exploring who Jesus is. They're just ordinary folk. The Jews for John, especially from chapter 7 onward, are those who are in leadership, the power brokers of the faith, of the religion, and they are the ones seeking to eliminate their threat of Jesus. They think Jesus is a threat to them, and they want to eliminate Jesus. And so John makes that distinction. You start to see it become more and more of a reality in chapter 7 and 8 in particular, but as the gospel goes on. Let's pick it up in verse 25 of John chapter 7. Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, "Is not this the one or the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him? Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?" Then the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. And Jesus said to them, "I will be with you a little while longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." The Jews said to one another, "Where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, 'You will seek me and you will not find me'? And yet, where I am going, you cannot come." So here we have this division, right, between the crowd who is really exploring the reality of the possibility that Jesus is the Christ. They're asking a very pointed question, a very simple question. If this man is the guy who they say he is, if he is so harmful, why in the world are they allowing him to speak in public? It's an interesting dynamic to me, because the Jews, the leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests are trying to eliminate, quote, the threat of Christ to the people. Now, I've said this many times before when I've taught on the Pharisees. I think we give the Pharisees a bad rap. I think part of the reason we do that is because we read John's gospel. I think we also view it from a modern perspective and through a modern lens, a philosophical lens, where we want to, especially as everyday folk, whether we're middle class or working class, we want to rise up against the elites. And so we tend to think this as elite control over and a pursuit of power and power-hungry people. I do think that's a dynamic that is clearly portrayed by John here in John's Gospel, somewhat in chapter 7, but also elsewhere. But I don't think that's really the heart of the Pharisees. I think the Pharisees, if we can be generous to them, are actually people who are trying to protect the Jewish faith. They're trying to protect the people from a potential false prophet. And so they're trying to address the issue. I think they're confused. I think certainly there's a power issue at work with them. But I think their ultimate motivation is they're trying to protect. And so they're trying to see what Jesus has to say. And so they're in a difficult place. Because what do? Because there is a sense in which you are called to care for the people, and you're called to be in leadership of the people. And the people, to a large degree, are intrigued by this Jesus, and many are believing. We're told at the end of the first portion of our reading that many of them believed in him. Many of the crowd believed in Jesus. This group of people believed in Jesus. And so I think it's interesting that you read through John's gospel in particular. You constantly see many believed, people believed, some believed, many believed, etc. That's kind of said throughout John's gospel. You get to Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Peter stands up and preaches, and everybody hears in their own language at a feast of Pentecost. So a lot of the same people presumably would be present at the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Pentecost. They have heard this tale of Jesus' resurrection. They remember all that Jesus did. 50 days after his resurrection, at the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people are added to the number. I tend to think that a lot of those people are the ones who came back from maybe being in hiding or questioning once Jesus was arrested and crucified. But then after they heard the message of the gospel proclaimed more powerfully through the ministry of the Spirit, once the Spirit is poured upon them, they believed in him before, they wondered, and now they've come back. And I think they realized this guy really is who he said he was. But they listen to him. They believe, they're intrigued by what he has to say. The Pharisees, the leadership, now perceives it to be a bigger problem than it was. They let him speak publicly. They weren't going to stop him from speaking publicly because they didn't want, they were afraid of their own heads, in a sense. But now the people are starting to believe. Now they're starting to follow. Think about it. If you're a Pharisee and you're challenged, and your goal is to protect the sheep, as it were, and protect the religion, now people are starting to believe. You start saying, "Wait a minute, this is a bigger problem than we anticipated it being." Yes, it's a threat to our leadership, but it's also a threat to the people. If I could be generous to the Pharisees this morning. And so now they're starting to say, we got to do something about this problem. So they send officers to arrest Jesus. And Jesus' response to them is, I'll be with you a little longer than I am going to him who sent me. Now, Jesus is speaking of his death, resurrection, and ascension. They're confused. A little longer. At this point, probably a year and a half out. They're saying, what does this man mean that I can't come to where he is? Well, you can't come to where he is because where he's going to go to be with his Father, you have to go through him through faith. And if you don't go through him, you're not going to get there. Jesus is clear here. Now, he will directly say that in John chapter 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. But if Jesus is going to the Father, you got to go through Jesus, or you're not going to be there. And so we got to wrap this up this morning, but I think it's important here is that they're starting to ask questions. So you start to see this division in John's gospel. And this division is between the Pharisees and the people, between the chief priest and the crowd. The crowd is starting to be intrigued. The crowd is starting to believe. The religious leaders are starting to push back and start saying, wait a minute, we got a problem. And that will develop throughout. And sometimes that happens in our own world. The question for us is, were we willing to believe who Jesus is? You guys have a great day. God bless you. I'll catch up with you next time.
You carry me close to your heart and show